Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I am so grateful to be joined by Steve Reed. Steve and I have been trying to get together for the past several months, and it's just been crazy on both ends. So I really appreciate him being able to come on and that we were both able to make time to have this conversation because I'm really excited about it. I'm very excited about the topic that we have felt impressed to talk about today. As host of this podcast, I have every once in a while people reach out and say, "Hey, can you talk about this particular topic?" And I see what we're talking about today as perhaps covering a lot of the recommendations that I get from people, particularly those who have family members or friends who have a different relationship with God, with the church, and who perhaps struggle sometimes with the choices that their loved ones have made in regards to those things. So I'm very excited to have this conversation where we're going to be talking about the stages of faith. And I hope that everyone can approach this topic with just an open mind and open heart. And hopefully each of us can self-evaluate and say, where am I at in this process? Where might my loved ones be in this process? And can I be okay with the fact that we are at different places and that that is fine, that God is okay with that, that it's a good thing, that we're each in our own position in developing this relationship with God. So again, Steve, thanks so much for coming on and having this conversation. Can you give our listeners a little bit of background on you and also your ministry, OneClimbs?
Oh yeah, sure thing. I'm from South Texas. That's where I grew up down there on the Gulf Coast. And yeah, at some point I would like to kind of tell the whole story because it's got some pretty crazy aspects to it. But um, I started One Climbs originally as a way to express my thoughts about the gospel, about theology, life, and some of my personal experiences to my children. And I decided to make it public because I had this whole library of Google Docs on my computer, and I would have conversations with people all the time about various spiritual topics, and I would find myself having to go in and research all this information. So I started taking some of these big, long email exchanges that I had, put them into Google Docs, and then I had such a big library of those after a while. I said, well, I think some of these things would be valuable to just put out there. And it was really this. It was Elder Ballard. He said, if you have the capability to create a blog, to put something there out there online, you should do it, and let your testimony be heard. So I was like, okay, because at first I was like, this seems like a preachy thing to kind of put out there. So I said, okay, if this could be useful to somebody else, then here you go. So I'm not going to promote it. I'm not going to run ads. I'm not going to sell anything. I'm just going to put it out there, and whoever happens to find it, great. And so that's what I've been doing with One Climbs for the past, 14 years. And it hasn't really changed too much beyond that. It's just kind of been the same thing. I just publish stuff. I don't have a schedule. I don't have any particular thing. It's just if I find something I have that is of value, then I put it out there. And if I don't, I'll go months without saying anything. So
Mhm.
that's just kind of how I do it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's awesome. I asked this just out of personal curiosity because I think that my podcast has kind of been that way for me. Like it's been a
Mm,
chronology of my own growth and thoughts and my conversion to Jesus Christ
mm.
and how I've changed. And I know I look back, the podcast is only not quite 3 years old, but I go back to the beginning episodes and I'm like a little bit embarrassed because because I just see how much I've grown and how much I've learned and I go back to those early episodes and I'm like, oh man, poor little Meghan, like you didn't know anything, obviously with a lot of compassion. But have you noticed that with yourself? Like if you were to go back to some of your earlier blog posts, do you see an evolution and a
Yeah.
change in yourself?
Yeah. I mean, it's that feeling of embarrassment is just a recognition that you've grown,
Hmm.
right? And that's a good thing. When I look back to how I thought as a child, I'm like, oh my gosh, I actually believed, certain things
Right.
and looked at the world this way. And I think that's a good thing to kind of document and see how you've grown and changed. So I've been really big into art and design my whole life. And one of these lessons I learned earlier, and I think it was about in sixth grade, um, I got really bummed out of the lack of progress I felt I was having as an artist. And I would just look at people way better than me, adults, right? And then I would look at myself and I would go, wow, I'm so far away from them. I don't think I could ever be that good. And so what I started doing, and it just kind of happened by chance, is I happened to come across some drawings that I did 6 months before.
Mm.
And I looked at them and I said, wow, I've gotten better. Right. And so I recognize this and say, you know what? Every 6 months, I'm just going to look back at my old artwork and compare. And I'm going to focus on my growth um, personally. How have I grown personally rather than looking at people that are so far ahead of me? And so that became kind of a habit. And once I started doing that and comparing myself with myself, then my progress began to just grow. And
Mm.
I stopped caring. Instead of being intimidated by people that were beyond me, I started to become inspired by people that are beyond me. And I
Mm.
started to be grateful that they were that good and that I had something I like they're showing what's possible, right?
Mm.
Instead of being judgmental or intimidated about it. And so I think that's kind of poured itself into my spiritual journey as well, and just my pursuit of growth and things like that. And so anyway, sorry, that's a long answer to a question.
No, no, that's beautiful. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and it doesn't have to be a blog or a podcast like these
Mhm,
public things that we've put out there. But I think having some, whether it be a journal or just
mhm,
something that we keep individually that we can reflect on and say, oh my goodness, look at all this growth, look at the things that I've learned. I think perhaps one of the biggest benefits to me is that it's this really tangible evidence that God is working with me.
absolutely. Yeah.
Because sometimes we're so like caught in the nitty gritty of the day to day, and we're trying to grow spiritually, but it's so hard, right? Like in this material world that we're in, and being embodied in a telestial state, it's so challenging sometimes to keep that bigger perspective.
Mhm,
And some of that's on purpose. We are veiled for I think really good reasons a lot of the time. But having some sort of touch point that we can reflect on and say, "Oh, God is in this with me. God is working with me." Um, I think that that's really useful. So thank you for sharing that wisdom.
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so in terms of our topic today and the stages of faith, can you first off tell us how you got introduced to this, I would say this theological model that we're going to discuss? And then also, what is the background of it? Like where did it originate from? And we'll kind of lay that foundation and then we'll start talking a little bit more about it from an LDS perspective.
Yeah, so this is a topic that, like I've said, I'm certainly not an expert on, but it's a topic that I think even a very simple understanding of it can be pretty just paradigm changing, and can have all kinds of really positive effects for people. So I think if you choose to listen today through this conversation we have and what we discuss, there's going to be a lot of thinking and wrestling and exchange of ideas, but I think what you'll get out of it is that you'll be able to live with yourself and others in greater peace. And you'll be equipped with some very powerful, I believe, tools that will help you to do that. And so many of these things, are taught to us in scriptures, but I think we just see them as just being just these small little things that are very difficult to understand and even harder to apply. And so hopefully this can kind of open that up a little bit to a greater understanding of human psychological development, as well as how we develop in our faith and our perspectives and how that works with all these different people. And I think you'll also understand why there's so much conflict between different individuals. And when you realize what the stakes are and what the landscape is, you can navigate that conflict, I believe, a lot easier. Um, Now, I had heard about stages of faith here and there, just over my research of theology and poking around. But for me, the biggest impact that was made was this audio clip I found, and I can't remember to this day like where I found it, but I downloaded it and I posted it on my blog, OneClimbs, so that it would always be there, so I'd never lose it and other people can benefit from it. And I've come to listen to it about once a year. I go in and listen to it. It's 2 hours long, and it's John Pauline, who's a Seventh Day Adventist, who's speaking to others. And you don't have to be a Seventh Day Adventist to appreciate what they're talking about. There's not a lot of Seventh Day Adventist really orthodoxy and stuff in there, but
Mm, yeah.
there's actually a lot of similarities to the LDS practice. They talk about callings and things like that, but they are mostly concerned with how understanding these things can help people minister. And so a lot of my understanding of the stages of faith was based on this audio recording, because they go through in depth explaining everything, applying it, and it was really, really helpful to me. And then of course, there's the book. It's James W. Fowler is the guy who wrote this book, and it's the subtitle is The Psychology of Human Development and the Quest for Meaning. And it's very fascinating. There's a lot of like anecdotal stories of people in the journeys, and describing like interviews that he has with people at different phases, and what types of things they say, how they look at things, how they reconcile things. And he uses that to kind of help understand some of these frameworks. What's kind of interesting though is, as he goes and describes all the stages, he's actually like, stage 5 is the hardest one for me to define. And he goes, I'm not even sure it exists, but he goes, I think it does. So when you read through the book, you get the sense that he's like, this is very theoretical, right? This is just trying to understand things. And I think in that respect, he's very humble about his take on this. He's not like, this is the be all end all of everything. And so he has a very humble approach to this. He's just trying to understand things, and help churches and ministries and people to assist people in their spiritual growth and development is essentially, what he's trying to do, and why he wrote this. And I don't think that it's a perfect model in that it explains everything, but like I said, really no model is perfect, right? They all have their flaws. They're all approximations, abstractions of reality, but they can be useful in that they give us a new framework on which to build understanding, right?
Mhm.
When we have a new framework in place, we can build a whole new wing to our understanding of something in our mind, and fill it full of experiences and ideas and our own personal recollections. And those types of things I find really fascinating. So
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a hallmark of a good tree, so to
yeah, yeah.
speak, that they don't boast of themselves. They're pointing to the fruit and saying, try the fruit, and
Mhm.
then you'll know. So I appreciate that about Brother Fowler. Um, awesome. So let's dive in a little bit more into just kind of overviewing what the stages of faith are, and maybe we can apply
Mhm.
it more specifically to LDS, to our framework in terms of our jargon and what things tend to manifest as members of the church specifically.
Sure. So there are 6 stages of faith, and I've got some notes here. And some of these titles are going to sound a little confusing, but I'll try to clarify them a little bit so they make sense. Stage 1 is called the intuitive projective faith, and this is usually around the people of ages 3 to 7 years old are in this stage. And what intuitive projective means is they tend to project their own experiences, feelings, emotions, and understanding onto their understanding of what faith is, right? They're very much shaped by stories, symbols, and images, and are very heavily influenced by family and culture. And and so really there's in this stage there's not much of a distinction between myth and reality. There's monsters under the bed. A tooth fairy comes and puts money under my pillow, and there is a God in heaven who blesses me when I pray. All of those things are part of the same universe in their head, right? They all
Hmm.
exist. They're
Hmm.
all just as real. And there's no really getting beyond that. They are literally at a stage of development in their minds where they cannot see beyond that. That's how they visualize things. And so that's stage 1. Stage 2 is mythic literal faith. And this is based on a more kind of concrete understanding of uh, the literal interpretation of religious stories and beliefs, right? And so in this stage, the myths establish and cement between right and wrong, right? This is right, this is wrong. Um, and they understand a lot of these myths and stories as factual events, right? You've often heard, I believe, who was it? It was one of our general authorities talked about how there was a literal Adam and Eve, but much of the Genesis account is is symbolic, right? There's a lot of symbols in there. Even the creation story. There's a really great book I finished recently called The Lost Worlds of Genesis 1. He was talking about how the book of Genesis describes more of a functional creation rather than a material creation. And it's God establishing his cosmic temple, so to speak. And by taking it too literally, we're kind of missing the boat on what's being described here, and a lot of really kind of key details. And
Mm,
that there's a lot of this conflict between creationism, literal creationism, and evolution and the Big Bang
mm,
and all these other things. And there's this battling of heads, and he presents a way to understand a little bit more. But yeah, there's this very kind of black and white sense of things at this stage.
mm,
Very influenced still by by parents and things like that. Stage 3 is synthetic conventional faith, and this happens within adolescence, the adolescent stage. And synthetic means it's constructed or placed together, and conventional means it conforms to a larger group of a faith system or a community, right? And so they tend to align their beliefs with those around them, family, church, all those things. And they feel very dedicated to those things. Someone might say, "I believe as the others around me do," and typically outsiders are heretics, and we have the truth, nobody else does. And it is very, the way I like to describe it, it's like constructing this box, and you put a bunch of things into the box, and everything in the box is good, and everything out of the box it has not yet been touched by good. It's
mhm,
just it's off limits or mistaken, and you can tell a lot about a person's stage of faith by the way they talk about their faith. and
mm,
and most people in stage 3, the synthetic conventional, Fowler says most people stay in this stage for the rest of their life, the vast majority of people. um, and that's not a bad thing. So none of these stages are wrong or bad, and somebody may never go into stage 4, 5, and 6. It's not a They're not places you have to go. One isn't better. They just represent different states of being, right? And how you look at the world. And for some people, that worldview does not change. But yet, a person like this, they will go out and they will do their ministering, right? They believe
mm,
that everything ever done by a president of the church or the church itself has been nothing but good and holy. Anyone who criticizes it in any ways is a bad person, or may be an apostate or something like that. And they will go and someone will be sick, and guess who's going to show up at their doorstep with a meal? That person. But
mm,
all the other critical people, they're not the ones showing up, they're not the ones assisting it, but this person will. And you'll see people do this throughout their life and live long, wonderful, blessed, and helpful lives to people. And many, many, many people are in this phase across all different faiths, right? They have
mm,
their faith tradition, they honor it, and they're good people. Now, where it starts to get really interesting in this whole stages of faith is stage 4.
mhm,
And there are a great deal of people who fall into stage 4. And I think even more so with the advent of the internet and mass communication and exposure to knowledge and ideas, we're more exposed to different ideas and information than any other generation in the history of the world, by far, above and beyond. So stage 4 is the individuative reflective faith. This usually happens in young adulthood somewhere. Um, and it says it reflects a growing sense of personal responsibility for one's faith. It's very reflective in that it denotes critical thinking, right? You begin to question things like you never had before. And usually it starts when you find a flaw in the box.
mm,
It's like you turn the box over one day and all of a sudden there's a crack in it. And you go, "Whoa, this box is not the perfect seamless box I thought it was." Well, if it's flawed here, where else is it flawed? And you start really looking at everything and critically examining different things. Um, and what can end up happening, a place where somebody can get stuck there, is they'll take that box, they'll tear it to pieces, and then they'll put everything back into that box and now say everything in here is bad, right?
mm,
And anything that comes out of that box is now bad. Like I was betrayed. often people, and among my group of friends, we're having a conversation about this, and someone in stage 4 can often feel like when they're talking to someone to stage 3 is, stop gaslighting me, quit
Mhm.
gaslighting me and tell me the truth.
Mhm.
All you're doing is trying to like pretend that these things don't exist. And so it can get very difficult. Stage 4 people can be very hard against stage 3, see them as very naive, can see them as having their eyes closed. And stage 3 people can look at stage 4 people and say, oh, they're backsliders, they're apostates, they have fallen away from the
Mhm.
faith. And these kind of absolutes and black and whites being thrown back and forth are not helpful, and to a large degree they're not true. Somebody who has entered stage 4 is not an apostate. They've just simply outgrown a pot. It's like you take a plant, and for some reason that plant has outgrown the pot. It's cracked the pot. The roots are growing out. You can't just force it back into that pot. It needs to go into a different pot. But sometimes that plant doesn't get put into any pot at all because you're only accepting that it goes in that little pot. So the plant dies, right?
Mhm.
Instead of finding a new pot and discovering what that is. And I think finding that new pot is kind of stage 5, jumping ahead a little bit. But stage 4, um, people, and I have, I've been through that stage in my life, but it happened very earlier on for me. And what triggered it was something very different than what may trigger some other people. But that's, again, that's a whole other story. I don't have time to tell that one. But um, so what should we do with people in stage 4? One of the things that I think the wisdom John Pauline adds that's not necessarily in the book is he says the most important thing to do with people in stage 4 is to listen to them and to allow them to be heard and let them express where they're at, and not try to ostracize them from everywhere else. Like make them feel they're still here. There's still a place
Mhm.
for them. But unfortunately, once we start getting into the higher stages of faith, we're getting fewer and fewer people, right? So the option that you'll have maybe a stage 5 person able to mentor a stage 4 person gets harder and harder. And
Mhm.
we don't really have any mechanisms in our church for dealing with that. We simply refer them back to maybe people who are in stage 3 who have a different outlook. And that's where I think people can no longer feel welcome at church. And
Yeah. Mhm.
so I think there's advice for stage 3 people on how to deal with stage 4 people, but there's also advice for stage 4 people and what they should be looking for as well.
Mhm.
Um, Now, then we get into stage 5. This is called conjunctive faith. And Fowler says it's very rare for people before middle age to enter this stage of faith. It's possible and it does happen, but it's rare. And conjunctive refers to the integration of different aspects of faith, including paradoxes and conflicting viewpoints, right? So individuals at this stage, they learn to hold together multiple perspectives and embrace complexity, right? And then they begin to realize, okay, they're actually, let's get rid of the boxes for a minute and let's look at how things fit together, right? At this stage, I feel like the way I say it is you stop building boxes in a
Mhm.
sense. And that may be a little tricky to understand, but um, the way I would, a good way to explain it is a stage 5 person can deal with paradoxes. A stage 4 person, a stage 3 person might say, um, there are no paradoxes. It's a mystery of God, and I trust that He'll explain things one day. That's not acceptable to a stage 4 person. A stage 4 person says, I don't see paradoxes, I see contradictions. Contradictions means falsehoods, da 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 da. I need somebody to explain this black and white so I can have a clear answer. And otherwise, none of this makes sense. In stage 5, you go, oh, well, all the paradox means is that there's wisdom that my experience has not granted me with. And I see that paradox as a doorway to a greater understanding. So I will choose to wrestle with it and learn from it what I can, right? That's kind of the way I would explain it. And stage 5 person will return back to their original myths and symbols, but with a much deeper understanding of this. One of my favorite ways to describe this is the kind of the Santa Claus effect, right? When you're a little child, you believe Santa Claus. You believe there's a man who flies around in a sleigh with magical reindeer dropping presents down. You write letters to him and things like that. And then at some point you realize, oh, that's my parents' handwriting on my presents, right? So one of the things I like to do with my kids is before they're baptized, somewhere around 7 years old. And I didn't learn this from Stages of Faith. This is just something that I did. But interestingly enough, the mythic literal faith is from ages 7 to 12. So it's right in that area. So it's in the area where they can actually understand these things. And so I'll take them to YouTube and I'll look up a video. I'll find a video about Saint Nicholas, who the guy really was, and I'll show them that video. I was like, I want to show you something about Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas, and I would say, here's who he is, right? And I'll just kind of let it dawn on them, you know, that they go, oh, and I'll explain to them that Saint Nicholas was a real person, and that the character of Santa Claus is a symbol of this really great man who expressed these very Christ-like attributes, and the aspects of this story are pertain to things he actually did, and qualities that we want to aspire to. So the easiest way for us to understand that is by this character, this symbol that was created called Santa Claus. And then they go, oh, so there is no Santa Claus. And what's really funny is my oldest daughter, she goes, when I had this conversation with her, she's 19 now, but back when she was 7, she goes, so there's no Santa Claus, there's no Easter Bunny, there's no Tooth Fairy, and there's no Queen of England. And I guess she got that from the movie Megamind.
Yes.
Right? But I didn't realize, I didn't catch that
That's
line, but I
hilarious.
just lost it at that point. But then, so she goes, okay, I get it now. I understand. And but then my third daughter, she, after I explained it to her, she goes, okay. She goes, but is it okay if I still pretend to believe in him for a little bit? And I said, sure. If you want to do that, you can pretend to believe in him, right? And so we had that kind of conversation. But she now had the ability and the freedom to kind of like choose what she wanted there. Now that's a process of growing up and going from, childhood into adolescence and into adulthood. It's really important here that we don't try to push people from one stage to another, right? It happens sometimes. We don't know. Sometimes finding critical information about your faith, your history, your doctrines or theology, that can shatter your box. And there's people going around online that try to, that like they're right here and they want everyone else to be here as well. So they'll try to push them into that. Stage 4 people often try to draw people into what they are because they they want to feel validated in what they're experiencing. And they're just searching for truth too. It's not that they're like bad people. They're trying to come at truth at a different way. And you have to work through that. And sometimes people can get stuck there for a very long time. Right. And there, at each one of these stages, there are ways to prosper in them. There's ways to transition from one stage to another that can just happen. And there's also ways to get stuck in them, right?
Mm,
There are pitfalls that come from being in that stage that are important to be aware of as well.
yeah.
Stage 6 is called universalizing faith. And he says that this is extremely rare. I think it may be less rare than he thinks, but he says this is a transcendent faith that moves beyond specific religious traditions or personal experiences to embrace all humanity in life. He puts people like Gandhi and Mother Teresa and people like that into this particular type of stage. But it's typically characterized by someone that has become fully converted to their faith tradition, to God, and basically lives without any fear at all. And this doesn't necessarily, and these stages of faith, we're talking about them a little bit from an LDS standpoint, but these stages of faith can exist in any faith, right? This is just more so about human development and our relationship to meaning, and particularly between meaning and symbols, and how we relate to meaning and symbols. If you were to boil all of this down, it comes to our relationship between how we understand meaning and symbols. Um, I have done a ton of research on symbolism over the course of my life, mainly because if you look behind me and you see all these symbols, these are logos that I've designed. I literally, one of the things to do is design symbols for a living. And so I've studied a lot of Carl Jung, a lot of psychology, a lot of the ancient archetypes of different cultures and civilizations to come to an understanding. I think honestly, um, living in the world of symbols and trying to understand it is probably the one thing you can do that will help kind of give you a deeper understanding of what meaning is.
Mm.
Because I could take symbolism and overlay it onto these stages, and we can see how that applies there. I mean, a stage 3 person might go say, "What does that symbol mean?" And they want to know the one thing that symbol means.
Mm-hmm.
They'll get confused when they read somewhere else that that symbol has an alternate meaning assigned to it, and they'll go, "Which one does it mean? This or does it mean this?"
Mm-hmm.
A stage 4 person might go, um, well, there's a contradiction there, so that it doesn't mean anything. It's just things people made up. A stage 5 person would go, oh, I can see that it has potential meanings.
Mm-hmm.
There could be many potential meanings, and those meanings can change and things like that. And what's really interesting about that, it has very much to do with the way that Easterners and Westerners think, right? Western thought is very influenced by the Greeks and is characterized by like really an algebraic way of looking at things. One, you know, there's steps, there's processes, there's the scientific method, there's a way that we come to information. And Eastern traditions are more abstract. And I think you can really see it in movies. Like if you've ever seen just a lot of the Marvel movies, right? They always end. There's a happily ever after. There's a resolution. The bad guy has exposition and explains everything to everyone and spills his guts. The good guy beats him and peace is restored and we're done and we wipe our hands. But then you watch a movie like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where at the end, the guy just kind of flies off into the clouds and then it ends and there's nothing there. And I remember when it came out, there were a lot of people going, I hated that ending. Like, what happened? Why can't we know what happened?
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever seen a lot of just Eastern movies, you'll see that there's open-endedness left. I remember the first Final Fantasy movie that was CGI that came out. They come up and there's no resolution. There's a huge question mark over the end. And that allows each person the ability to really personalize what could have happened at the end and makes it more interesting. Well,
Mm.
symbols are a lot of that, right? There, and the way I describe him is when God wants to say something, he just comes out and says it, right? Thou shalt not kill, something like that. But when he wants to say infinite things to infinite people, he'll use symbols. He'll tell stories of symbols. And you can anytime you see symbols popping up in the stories, the Lord is saying, okay, open yourself to the Spirit because
Mm.
there are many things to learn here and you'll learn many different things throughout the course of your life. And so
Mm.
it's important when you see that kind of teaching that it has that dynamic to it. So
Mm.
anyway, to kind of bring this back onto these stages of faith, it's very much a reflection of how we look at meaning in our lives, how we determine it, where we get it from, how we apply it.
Mm.
And so anyway, that's the introduction. So hopefully that covers most of the bases there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot of different places that we can go with this that I think could be useful and interesting. First off, I think maybe we can talk a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of transitioning from the early stages that kind of coincide with the early part of our human development, right? Like stages 1 and 2, which are more of that childlike, this innocence, we're developing, we're learning, but things are still pretty we don't understand complexity. We don't
Mhm.
understand duality. Symbols are going to have one meaning because that's all that we can kind of retain, right?
Yeah.
And then moving into the adult phases where we see this transition of faith. And what's interesting that I've witnessed, and we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, is that, when we talk about truth, it works on all these different levels, right? That's the idea of a symbol, is that a symbol can represent truth from the macro to the micro level.
Mhm.
And one way that I see these stages of faith is I see a masculine feminine duality in them, where when we're children, we're more feminine in our understanding, right? We're kind of there's a sense of dependency on those who are older than us, our mother and our father. We're looking to be told, but there's also the feminine aspect of mystery. and wonder and magic. And like, that's one of the beautiful things about childhood, right? Is that there is this potential, that there is Santa
Yeah.
Claus who comes down the chimney and blesses my life, and that there's joy in that. But as we grow up, we start to transition. I would say stage 2 is kind of this place of transition where we're moving from that magic and that mystery to realizing like, oh, things are also literal. Things also are concrete, right? There
Mhm.
is structure, there is physical reality in this
There's no
temporal
monster under
space.
my bed that's
Right.
going to
There's
come
not
kill me.
actually a monster under my bread. It's probably just my brother's socks, whatever. Like we're
Gross.
transitioning from this place of feminine wonder and mystery into a more masculine sphere. And then stage 3, I would say, is actually quite masculine, where, as you said, things are very black and white. There's one way to look at things. The box is good, everything else is bad. And people tend to get stuck there. And this is something that I see quite a lot in our faith and in every faith, honestly, is that we get to the point where we've been taught so much truth and it's blessed our lives that we do adopt it and we say, this is the way that it has to be. And we want to, as you said, we want to impose our box on other people and say, your box is wrong. You need to listen to
Mhm.
my box, right? Because it's kind of worked for me. And so I see a conflict brewing, especially in the church, where we have a lot of people who are kind of stuck in that stage 3. And then there are others who are transitioning more into the stage 4 and hopefully moving through stage 4. I think stage 4 could is a really powerful portal one way or the other. Um, Hopefully moving through that to be in stage 5, if that's what we're supposed to do, right? We all have our journey. There's expansiveness in all of this. So can we talk a little bit about that transitioning from stage 3 to stage 4 in the church specifically? And maybe what are some of the cultural traditions and things that we've inherited that keep us from making that transition perhaps as smoothly as we otherwise could? And how would you recommend someone who maybe is interested in making that transition but has some hesitancies?
Interested in making the transition from 3 to 4?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think typically a person uh, stage 4 can be characterized by the feeling that your faith is falling apart around you. I don't
Mm,
know that most people want to do that, right?
mm,
That's like the fear that a stage 3 person has, is their faith just falling apart and
mm,
not having it anymore. I think the one bit of wisdom that we can observe from this is, if you look at stage 1, 2, right? These are more children, and the child is not going to have the understanding of a parent because they're in different stages of psychological development. So it becomes the duty of the parent to then figure out how they're going to live at peace and reconcile with the child. And I think that plays for each one of these stages. I think the person who is one stage ahead, and I don't want to say ahead in terms of just ahead in development or anything like that, just in this model of stages. If you find yourself one stage ahead, I think it becomes important for that person to have the charity on the person who is in the stage prior, right?
mm, mm,
Because I don't think the person in the stage prior can totally understand where the stage 4 person is, but the stage 4 person understands both where the stage 3 and the stage 4 person is,
mm,
right? I think that's where the difficulty arrives, is are you willing to take the lead as you grow, right? Are
mhm.
you willing to be charitable to others? Are you willing? And so I think as we progress in these stages, we have to accept the responsibility that comes with the greater knowledge or the greater challenge that we find ourselves in, right?
Mm,
And I think as we as a person in that stage leads forth with that, it's going to create more peace and harmony with the other stages, right?
mhm.
Like if
Yeah.
the stage 4 person didn't try to drag the other person's faith down, but says, okay, that's where you are right now. How can I best help you grow where you are, knowing what I know?
Yeah.
Right? How would
Mm,
I do things? And to not try to compel other people to go down the same path that you have
mhm.
necessarily, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the case with each one of these stages, is the higher stages should minister and mentor the lower stages
Yeah.
rather
Totally
than
agree.
judging them, right? And that
Yeah.
becomes the greater challenge, because I think as you progress through these stages, your ability to judge the people who are at prior stages becomes like the temptation to that, I think, becomes greater, but also
Mm-hmm.
there's, I think as you get into stage 5 and 6, there's more of a grace that accompanies those things and more of letting go. I think stage 4 is probably the most intense. Like 3 and 4 are probably like the most intense and risky places to be at. But there's so much beauty and growth in each one of those, right?
Right.
So
Well,
I think that the chat. Oh, go ahead. Would you?
Well,
Sound like
yeah, I
you're
was just going to say, I love that. And I think that we really could, if we wanted to, again, add an additional layer of like LDS thought onto these stages. You could say that stages 1 through 3 are kind of an Aaronic level, that they're preparatory in a lot of ways. And then moving
Mm.
into 4, 5, and 6 is this higher law, the law of the gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, where my religion is being lived to the degree that I'm repenting, I'm healing, and God is filling me with love. God is filling me. That's the ideal, right? That's the potential of it. As you said, there's also the opposite, which is this pitfall, right? When you start moving into 4 and you're kind of disillusioned and you've been awakened, maybe in some ways, to the flaws with the system, with the institution, with people, with the world in general, that there is a greater temptation to judge and to be proud and to say, oh, I'm enlightened, I've learned all these things, and you guys are just, you're so dumb that you're stuck on that you still think that that's the way that things work. And that's a very real temptation. And I think that it's yeah, I think it's important both for those who are in the Aaronic, maybe the lower levels of that spiritual development, and for the person who is in that place, in that stage 4, for that person to cultivate as much grace and humility as possible. And sometimes I would say, even if you need it to be imposed on you, if you need to go to the Lord and say, Lord, please humble me because I see this in myself that could be potentially really damaging. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's that's an interesting parallel looking because the whole concept of there being an Aaronic and a Melchizedek priesthood is there's this whole idea of preparation,
Mm-hmm.
that there's something that prepares us for something else,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the ordinances have that as a feature to them. Every ordinance you look at, like let's take for instance baptism is not, no ordinance is the real thing. It's a symbol and a almost reenactment of the real thing. When
Mm-hmm.
you go into the water and you come out, there's somebody standing there with their arm to the square that represents the Lord resurrecting you. So
Mm-hmm.
by going into that water and being baptized, you want to be resurrected. Now, we're all going to be resurrected, but this is resurrected by the Lord. You're given a new name, which is the name of Christ, and you're also anointed by the Holy Ghost. And thus we become Christians or anointed ones. Christ means anointed one, right? So Christians are those who have been anointed by the Spirit. And so that's also pointing to, so the one baptism of water and the baptism that's of fire is something that comes directly from God that the ordinance points to. So the
Mm-hmm.
sacrament, we see the bread and the water, the body and blood of Jesus Christ rise up off of an altar and come and live in each one of us. We're watching a symbolic resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
We're commemorating the resurrection of Christ, and that we'll be resurrected and glorified into his state, that he will come and live in us, and that we will be one with him. We will be
Mm-hmm.
like Christ in the resurrection. And the same if we go into the temple and the ordinances there, they all are representative of real things that can and are intended to happen because of that preparation, right? And
Yeah.
so I do think though that you could, in a way, um, it would be interesting to explore more how you would take that concept of preparatory. And so you broke it up into the stages, like 1 through 3 and 4 through 6. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. That's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting way of putting it. But I do like your take on the masculine feminine aspect of things
Mm-hmm.
because there's some really great research on. So I only have daughters. I have 4 daughters. I don't have any sons. I had 3 sisters growing up, and I have 5 sisters-in-law. So I'm
You're a
surrounded by
girl
women.
guy.
I don't know. I don't know what to do with guys sometime, right? And I'm like, I don't, what do we do with you? But I am fascinated by the development of males and females and how um just some of I think like Carl Jung in his research into the human mind and dreams and stuff. And there is this image of the mother, that this protective mother that at least the sons experience, the daughters do as well, but um, it's very important for boys as they age up. They have to leave the presence of their mother. They
Mm-hmm.
have to become cut off and they have to enter the world of men. And that means they have to go and do hard things. Because the way it was explained one time, I thought was kind of interesting is uh, a girl knows that she's a woman when something physical happens to her body,
Mm-hmm.
right? She enters puberty and it's like, you're a woman now.
Mm-hmm.
But to be a man, you have to be told by other men that you're a man. You
Hmm.
have to be accepted into the world of men. And it's completely different for men and women. You can lose your manhood. Like if you fail to live up for the principle, if you don't stand up for your wife or your children or your nation, or you express, weakness and you don't live up to the qualities of man, it's like you can lose your manhood, but you're not going to lose your womanhood. You are a
Mm-hmm.
woman. It's a
Hmm.
physical reality. Whereas for men, it's more of like um a subjective thing that can
Hmm.
be gained and lost, right? Which is kind of interesting because those things kind of flip-flop on a spiritual level, where often men are described as more structure and women are described as more like subjective and feeling, but they can kind of flip-flop. And
There's an
that
integration there.
that might
Yeah.
confuse a stage 3 person, but a stage 5 person is like, oh, that's really cool. I love
Yeah,
it.
4,
You
5,
know
and
what
6
I'm
is like, oh, that's
saying?
fascinating. Stage 3 is like, what are you talking about? This is so yeah, no,
Well,
it is
yeah.
really interesting. Well, and I would say that that is actually a characteristic of moving into stage 4 is that you're actually, as a stage 3, learning to reintegrate the feminine of your stage 1 and 2. That's what
Yeah.
can move you into stage 4 is that I'm not going to get caught on just the masculine. I want the mystery. I want to ask questions. I want to not know all the answers all the time. I want the magic and the wonder. That's the feminine. And so it's bringing that back on a
Mhm.
whole new level. It's these cycles, right? Creation, fall, atonement. We're
Mhm.
supposed to be doing that constantly. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying. That is really interesting. You know what I find most interesting about that, and this is a little bit of a tangent, going back to what
Go
you were
for it.
saying about how women know that they're women, by the physical experiences that they're having, and that men have to be told. I actually think that that's a very strong parallel to what priesthood and priestesshood is like.
Mm.
We've lost a lot of the concepts around priestesshood, but I would make the argument, and I think I can back it up spiritually, that women are born into the priestesshood. We don't have to be
Right.
ordained. It's a part of who we are. We come here with the power and capacity that we need. We have been authorized from God since our birth. Whereas men, there are some qualifications that need to be met
Mhm.
before that's the order that they're entered into. So I just thought that that was a really interesting parallel that you brought up there. And I'm not suggesting that any of this is hard and fast truth. Like, I think that there's probably variability and maybe someone needs more or less preparation. It's probably not fair to say, oh, yeah, 1 through 3, you're totally in the Aaronic level. But just the idea of, yes, there is a preparation. And then the goal is to move past the preparation. And I think we see that challenge when we look at symbology and particularly how we see symbols in the church, because as you were pointing out, we tend to look at the symbol and think that it's the real thing.
Mhm.
And we're participating in these beautiful rituals and these symbolic ordinances, and we think, great, like I did that thing, instead of thinking like, oh, there's like a higher reality that I want to step into where I am experiencing that in real time. And the duality there is important, right? If we want to jump to stage 5 and say, well, there's value in both. Like there's value in the Aaronic preparatory levels and there's value in the higher levels. It's meant to be like a portal that we walk through. The goal is to not get stuck at one of those places. Although I think that's probably fairly inevitable at one point or another. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, and this goes, I think, to one of I think the flaws in the model, at least from an LDS perspective, and
Hmm.
I wouldn't even say from an LDS perspective, more from the doctrine of Christ perspective, because when you look in the scriptures, these stages don't exist, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
more of a psychological model of human development.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It doesn't really have any there are similarities to where we find ourselves in the gospel, because on the gospel journey, I would say the gospel version of stage 3 is getting a seed, right? Let's say I have a peach pit, and this peach pit is from there's this peach tree that's out in Georgia, and it's on an unknown part of land, right? Like nobody knows about it except a select few people, and it produces the most delicious fruit in the world. Not just peach fruit. It's delicious. Nobody's ever tasted anything like this. And I take one of these peach pits and I give it to you. And I said, I've been to this tree. I've tasted the fruit. Here's a seed for yourself. And you take that seed and you put it in your pocket and you go, wow, I have in my pocket, in my possession, this seed. And you tell other people about it. Did you know I have this seed? Wow, I have this seed. It's great. It's wonderful. I can feel it in my pocket, right? Like it's here. There's a tangibleness to it, right? But you have not yet planted it and you have not yet tasted the fruit, right?
Mm.
So there comes a time in your life where you no longer you simply can't live with not knowing what that fruit tastes like yourself. And this is the journey that I went through, you know. Um I saw these people in the scriptures and people around me testifying of something, and I didn't have it, and I wanted it, but I didn't know where to go or where to start. So I had to go through the search and the wrestle and the that path of kind of the darkness, right? And some one of the phrases that's used to describe is like the dark night of the soul, right? Where you feel like you have nothing to hold on to except this idea, this hope that there's something there, and just bit by bit. And I think it's really interesting that in Lehi's vision of the tree of life, we have this mist of darkness between where the path starts and where the tree starts. And I think when people encounter this mist of darkness, I think there's a lot of people who believe that they're at the tree simply because they grew up in the church and they got baptized and they went through these things and they were told, oh, you're a member of the church, and they experienced these temple ordinances and rituals and things like this. And then they get to some point in their middle life and they're like, wait a minute, like what is the atonement? I've never have I experienced this,
Mm.
And I think it's telling that Alma in Alma 5, he says, you brethren of the church, have you been spiritually born of God? He specifically asked the brethren of the church. There was a Baptist church that I went to with my neighbor in Las Vegas when I lived there for a bit, and she played the piano at her church, and her and her husband went there. Their family. We had little kids that were around the same age, and we had a really great relationship. They brought us cookies when we first moved in. We went over there, and they said, "You guys are Latter Day Saints, aren't you?" And I said, "Oh yeah." And we got in this discussion, and I said, I said, I love the fact that you guys are our neighbors. You guys seem like awesome people. And and I can tell that you guys are faithful people. Like I can tell that you love your faith because you've shared it with us freely. I said, we're the same way. We love our faith too. And I said, I want you guys to feel completely comfortable talking about your faith around us. Like
Mm.
anything you have to talk about, we want to support you in any way we can. And we hope that you'll feel the same way about us. And that opened up this amazing door. So we'd go to the temple and they'd babysit our kids and they'd come back and go, hey, how was the temple? And we say, oh, it was great. There's a story of the Garden of Eden, and it's like scripture you get to experience. And we talked about different things, and they're like, oh wow. And we go to church with them. And it was just this really great relationship that we had with them. And they would talk about like the difficulties that were happening at their church with finances and stuff. They were very open about things, but it was great to have that type of dialogue. And we never tried to like bend and twist them into our faith, and they never tried to do that, with us. But it was this mutually beneficial thing. But their pastor said something really cool. Is he stood in front of the whole congregation and um, he goes, some of you in this congregation may not know what the next step is that you want to take on your spiritual journey, right? And he goes, if you feel like you're in a place in life where you just don't know what that next step is, where you want to go with God. Maybe there's somewhere you haven't gone with God yet. We invite you to come and speak to one of our next step ministers, right? And there was a big sign on the wall that said next step ministry. And I thought that was such a cool idea, right?
Mm.
And um and I think that's something that I think we're missing
Yeah.
from our processes. And I think that just comes from a mentality to where we think we have everything. But one of the things I discovered, and there's actually a talk called Born of God by Ezra Taft Benson, where he says, besides being baptized with water and confirmed, every member of the church should be born of God, right? And they should be able to have that experience. And so that was an experience that I had, baptism of fire, unmistakable, completely changed my heart, completely changed my life. um, all of a sudden, all of the scriptures, all of these individual scriptures, I realized what they were all talking about. They were all
Mhm.
talking about the same thing. It was like facets to a gemstone. And but I saw them as different stones, different shards and pieces when I realized, oh, they're all talking about the same thing. And so what I began to realize over the years is how I'd listened to the way people talked about the Savior and the atonement. Because I thought at the time, oh, wow, this is everyone's experienced the same thing. I'm not part of the club, right? Great. I know what everyone's talking about now. And then I began to realize that there are far fewer people than I thought that who had experienced these things. And so it's like having that seed in your pocket and thinking
Mm.
you have it when you don't, and then realizing you don't and panicking about it and not knowing what to do. And then some people go off, they go through the work of planting that seed and growing it. Other people, they can't figure out how to do it. They don't,
Mm.
they can't put the pieces together, and they just kind of wash their hands of it and walk away, which is,
Mm.
I think, kind of sad. But I think one of the things we're lacking in is a real mentorship, right?
Yeah.
Like stage four people, I know sometimes they can feel like, hey, this whole thing isn't true. I don't want to support an organization that's teaching things, and then they'll just back off. But then they
Hmm.
come back later on because they start to have experiences, and they pick up kind of where they left off, but they look at it from a different way. And now they really, really deeply care,
Yeah.
and they're willing to do that kind of spiritual work to plant that seed and grow it,
Mm.
and then they taste that fruit and they come back. And so
Yeah.
um
Can I add
it's
something to that? No, I love that analogy of the seed in the pocket. I think that that's so apt. And I think it works on these other levels that we're talking about, with stage three being kind of this masculine level, right? The masculine is represented
Mhm.
by the seed, whereas the feminine, you've got to plant the seed in the soil, in the earth, right? In Mother Earth
Right.
to bring forth the tree. And the fruit is the union of that masculinity and femininity. So I think that that's really beautiful. And I'm glad that you bring up this point, because just as you were talking, I think, and we can explore this together as I say it out loud.
Mhm.
But I wonder if the transition from 3 to 4 is actually not a transition that we can make by ourselves. Because it does feel to me that a lot of the time, um, that is where you have to have that moment of spiritual rebirth. And that's kind of the thing that can move you to the next level. And I think that maybe that looks different for a lot of people. I know that in the audio, they talked about how stage 3 is where men tend to get kind of caught and perhaps have that rebirth experience, and then that's what catapults them into stage 4. And women, it tends to be more in stage 4, which makes sense because 4 is reintegrating the feminine, and we're
Mm.
feminine, so there's kind of a natural process that's taking place there. But either way, there is this moment, if you are moving through the stages and not getting stuck on them, there is this moment where all we can do is have a broken heart. And then the Lord takes the seed and plants it in our heart. And then we start to help cultivate that seed and we watch it grow, right? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Hmm. I do think when you talk about the masculine and feminine aspects, although I that's kind of a new way of thinking of overlaying it onto this. My gut tells me that you're onto something, because the masculine and feminine overlay all of the scriptures, all of reality. Um, the whole universe is based off a like a binary system. Even computers, you take one and zero, and you can create infinite possibilities from just two. Even you have yin and yang in the creation of the Ba Gua from um, Taoism. You know, you've probably seen like on the Korean flag the different trigrams and things,
Mhm.
and it's so all that stuff is super interesting. Um, as far as 3 and 4, I I do think you nailed something there, because in the book he talks about how it seems that more women enter into stage 4 than men do, and I think because of that dynamic. And then I think once you get into stage 5 and you're able to reconcile those things, I think the key differentiator there is once you begin to have experiences with God at that point, right?
Mm.
And I do, and I like the idea that you talked about reconciling the masculine and feminine, because I think we do kind of jump from one side to the other through our development, and it's really a reconciling of those two things that ultimately brings that peace. And I think that can be a very challenging thing to do. And it's even more challenging, I think, if we try to do it under the force of our own understanding alone. We're leaning on the arm of the flesh, right? And I think it really takes an immersion in the love of God, and being able to have that experience with God that fills you with that life, to where then you understand what the core is, where you have this reconciliation of love and understanding, and then you can take that out and then have that foundation on which to build kind of a greater understanding based on those experiences with God. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think without a conversion by God that it's going to be possible for uh, a lot of people to really reconcile those types of things.
Yeah.
I think you can get to it. I think there's a lot of people that have just been, flooded in ideas and philosophy and different things that, and on a bunch of different faiths, that are great people who can do great things with all those tools and experiences and things like that. And that's kind of one way of coming to get a glimpse of that understanding. But I think
Mm.
for all of humanity, the path that God has prepared, where we come into His presence and we have our hearts filled with His love, gives us that foundation that's approachable by
Mhm.
anybody, no matter what stage of faith they're in, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
accessible through all of these. And so it's not like you have to go from stage 3 to stage 5 to
Right.
feel that presence. But I do
Mm.
think there are characteristics of it described within these stages, but I don't think they're restricted to these stages, if that makes sense. Does that
Yeah,
kind of
for sure. For
answer
sure.
your
No, and
question?
I totally agree. I mean, God can if we are open, God can change us at any point. Like there's no restrictions, right? That we can put on God that would say, "Oh, he won't change me until I get to this stage of faith." Like that's just not how God works.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's really interesting to think about that encounter with God as foundational. I think it could also be aspirational in that it teaches us where we're headed. Another layer looking at kind of these lower levels of development and the higher levels of these stages of faith is that in the lower levels, we really do have to be told like what to do by children. Like it's
Mhm.
very much it's a checklist gospel of you need to read your scriptures every day, you need to pray, you need to go to the temple. Like it's very much geared towards those kind of perfunctory tasks that we need to do. And then when you're moving into the higher realms, part of what's so hard is that that roadmap kind of evaporates. Like those things are still there and that they're useful to a degree, but they can also become a hindrance if we focus on those instead of actually building a connection and a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And so for me and like my spiritual rebirth and my born again experience, it did become foundational, but it also was aspirational because for a period of time, God showed me what it felt like for me to be at stage 6, for
Mm.
me to just be filled with the love of God so much in myself that I could just pour it out for everyone else. That revelation was second nature, and loving my children was so easy. And like he showed me what was possible. And then you kind of come down from that and life sucks again. And like you have to build it up, but you still have that foundation of I know that I had this experience with God and God showed me what is possible. And I want that again. And so I'm going to lean on the Lord and he's going to show me like we're going to fill in the blanks of this roadmap that he gave me. And I'll know when I get to the destination because he let me feel what that feels like. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes complete sense to me. When you're describing that, like God lifting you up and then you have to like come deal with everything. There's actually, if you don't mind me sharing this really quick, this is a little statement by um Renee Dalmal, and this is the origin of the name OneClimbs. of my site, but this is one of my favorite quotes, and I kind of stole it from my old institute teacher, who was one of the best mentors I've ever had, and he would say this quote very often, and so I kind of just appropriated it and, and got the domain.
Mhm.
But this is what he says. He says, "You cannot stay on the summit forever. You have to come down again. So why bother in the first place? Just this: what is above knows what is below, but what is below does not know what is above. One climbs, one sees, one descends, one sees no longer, but one has seen. There is an art of conducting oneself in the lower regions by the memory of what one saw higher up. When one can no longer see, one can at least still know."
Mm. Yeah.
That reminded me of what you were saying there is, yes, God gives us a glimpse. So we climb these spiritual mountains. And this is what the whole temple experience and ascension is trying to teach us. Are and sometimes we get too caught up in the mechanics. David O. McKay once wrote that he was very like disappointed by the temple. He says, "I was disturbed by it and disappointed because I was too focused on the mechanics." He said, "I learned once I understood the symbols, then I kind of understood what God was trying to teach me." And so we climb these spiritual mountains, we go up them, and then God shows us something. And then he requires that we descend back down to that mountain and now go and live by what we've learned. And this is a pattern we've seen literally where God has called people up onto mountains and such. But it's the same is true for us. And it is aspirational, like you said, in that sense, is God is trying to call us upward so that we can see things as he sees them. And that's why I love the lectures on faith so much, and how lecture 5 describes the Holy Spirit as the mind of God. And we understand repentance, the Greek word of which that is a translation. And I think it's metaneos.
Metaneo. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it means a change of mind, right? And so you begin to see that to repent is to gain essentially a change of mind. Well, what mind is that? Well, it's a mortal limited mind to a divine eternal mind. And that God does this through the medium of his Holy Spirit. And we get caught up in trying to define, well, the Spirit is this, and it's a guy, and he's going to be born one day and receive a. It's like, no, just forget about all that for a minute and just think about the mind of God becoming your mind. That's
a good box that
that's
we
the
should all
point.
take out and
Yeah, yeah.
dump out most of what you have in that box.
We create all these little boxes of things, right?
Yeah.
And we stress them so much, and we get so concerned by all these things. But that's part of the wrestle. That's part of the wrestle, is wrestling and reconciling and trying to figure these things out. But I think it's important to know that each one of these steps we take in wrestling with these things at any stage is like climbing that spiritual mountain. God has something to show us that we can now come back and live by again. And guess what? He's going to call it, like Nephi was called up in the mountain several times. And then you have the brother of Jared, who was called up to the mountain and brought into the presence of God. And all of history, everything said nothing could be withheld from his view, because he knew that God could show him all things. So the veil is completely removed, and he sees everything as God sees it, which is incredible when you think about it. But then he still had to go back down and build those barges and suffer the voyage across the sea and all these other things, and the contention between his family. And so even God himself, who is high and above all things, he still condescends and looks down upon this earth and deals with all of us and all of our drama and everything that we have going on. And he's happy to do it because he has an understanding of the entire plan. He sees the end from the beginning, and all the suffering and the difficulties that we see, he's willing to share with us a portion of his mind, even to the point of the brother of Jared, where nothing can be withheld. He's willing to share all of it with us. But even a portion of that can be so powerful just in the living of our lives as we go through and experiencing things. And so, yeah, I get what you're saying on that. It's such an empowering idea, and it's an aspirational idea. Absolutely, for sure.
Are you just reading the scriptures, or have you learned to search them? If you haven't switched to using scripture notes, you haven't discovered the power of a tool designed for searching the scriptures. This incredible tool allows you to pull together search results from the standard works, apocryphal texts, and freedom documents into a collection you can study from. digging deeper with instant references to Blue Letter Bible, the LDS Citation Index, Webster's 1828 Dictionary, and more. You can even import your gospel library notes as well. Sign up now for a free trial at scripturenotes.com.